Hey everybody, we are going to take notes in Chapter 10 and talk about social class in the United States. So you can take down the title card now if you haven't. And we will continue on here. So let's talk about social class itself. So basically the question is like, what makes up someone's social class? And so there's kind of three factors that we include in sociology: property, power, prestige. And you take all those combined with wealth, and that can kind of determine social class. So generally, people in the highest social class have a lot of property and thus a lot of wealth, not just in their income, but wealth overall. They have power and they're respected. And we'll dig further into this as we go on with the notes. So wealth is a person's net worth, right? It's a combination of their money, their property, their investments, their companies, everything that they have. And that combined is their wealth. A lot of times you'll see numbers on people that they're worth this much. It doesn't mean they have that much in the bank, but that a combination of everything that they have equals that amount. If they really wanted that amount, they could have that in cash. But most people are not going to do that. And in the United States, the distribution of property and income is heavily skewed. And the people at the top have a lot higher percentage of the income than the people at the bottom. And this is how we get kind of a really longer social class structure where you have a very small amount of people at the very top with most of the money and a very large amount of people toward the bottom with little of the money. And that's something that definitely can be an issue. And the questions and solutions and how to fix that problem are, pretty massive. All right, let's go ahead on to the next slide here. So let's talk about power and prestige. Okay, what are these things? These are not, very concrete things that we can gauge and look at. But the people that make the decisions hold power. This might be politics. This might be companies that have a lot of influence or money or can influence things. And, you might say, hey, I can vote on things, right? We have a democracy. I vote for representatives that make decisions. I vote for the president. And that's all true, but you really don't maybe have the power to sway those people. So when we talk about like conflict theory, the thinking of Karl Marx of even if people have a say in a democracy, eventually those people in power are going to be swayed by other people in power. This sociologists call this the democratic facade, that we feel like we have power because we vote for people, but the real source of the power is in those who are elite, have a lot of money, that can influence politicians with money, and that becomes a bit of that issue. Prestige is kind of respect, right? So when we talk about respect of people, a lot of times it's tied to their occupation and what they do. So there's a lot of study done just in terms of asking about kind of respect of specific occupations and jobs, maybe something that we'll take a look at from the textbook and, looking at the United States versus other countries of how people view that. And generally there's four features to prestige: jobs that, pay more, that require more education, entail more abstract thought, and offer greater autonomy. People are more independent or self-directed. And so people give less prestige to jobs with the opposite characteristics. If they're low paying, if they require, less preparation or education, more manual physical labor, or are closely supervised. So it's something we might take a look at, in time. All right, that's the end of this slide. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one here. And so when you combine all these things, you get kind of a status, right? And some people may try to maximize their status by only having one of specific, one dimension. If someone wants prestige, right, they might focus on a specific thing. They may try to display their prestige through certain clothing that's more expensive, buying cars, things like that, right? There's kind of status symbols that show that status. And so, people might try to kind of, if you don't have all three, if you don't have a ton of money or property, you might try to up your prestige by looking like something that you're not, right? You may try to influence and get in power or in politics and have an influence even if you don't have the other things. So, some people are what's called status constant, where they have all three, but a lot of people are status inconsistent, where there is some conflict to, they claim a higher status than they have, or they kind of get stuck between two different statuses. So there was kind of a classic study in Chicago where janitors of apartment housing unionized and got a really good contract, made a lot of money. A lot of them made more money than a lot of the tenants in this apartment complex who were, middle class. So these janitors are taking out the trash, but driving, super expensive cars. And the people in the, in the apartment, were appalled, were offended that the janitors, they shouldn't have that type of car. They shouldn't have that type of prestige, right? They're just a janitor, and I'm this and I'm that, right? But hey, the janitors are doing well. They don't care what other people think. They were good. So it's interesting. Or you look at college professors. College professors is an occupation that has a fairly high prestige. They really don't make a lot of money, especially when compared to their education level. So it might be prestigious, but they might not have that property or that money that people that have doctorates generally have. So there can be kind of this difference. We see that if there is a big change instantly, that a lot of times it creates problems. Winners of the lottery or are coming into a big payday, often lose their family, their friends. When it's like you just jump from low class to high class, or from low prestige to high prestige and low property to high property happens, everyone comes calling for a payout. Everyone wants to split this. Now you have to defend yourself. A lot of people don't want it. A lot of people lose that money very quickly. There becomes a lot of risk. And so maybe it's not always for the better. And that's kind of a question. Let's go on to the next slide. You're done here. So we really take these ideas and turn them into the class system. And the early sociologists that we studied had specific classes that they put out there, right? Marxism had the capitalists, the bourgeois, had the workers, the proletariat, and some, even lower than that. So there's kind of a difference with that. Today, we look at, depending on what you look at, there's anywhere between 5 or 6 different classes. And working off the textbook, we'll kind of go with 6 different classes. So, capitalists at the top, that top 1%, the millionaires are now billionaires, make up that very small percentage. The upper middle class, usually college, university educated professionals make 6 figures. Lower middle class is, high school, maybe college or maybe bachelor's degree, crafts people, semi-professionals, about $60,000 a year. And that's usually the highest percentage of people in America. The working class usually has maybe a high school degree, usually with maybe some additional training, maybe not. Factory workers, clerical workers, about $35,000 a year. The working poor might have dropped out of high school. Low-paid salespeople, service workers make, $17,000 to $20,000 a year. And then the underclass, people that are unemployed, people that are, make under $10,000 a year. Now, sometimes, the education doesn't match the income, right? Like we talked about with college professors. So there could be other factors that come into play to really determine your social class. And sometimes people can kind of get caught in the middle, of some of these, and that can be a problem. That's something that we'll get into here. So, all right, let's move on to the next slide. So let's talk about the consequences of class in America. So, if people's physical health can be a cost, right? Medical care is very expensive in America. Insurance can force lower classes to forego physical health treatment, mental health treatment. Usually, if you don't have as much money, stress is going to be higher. Usually, some of those jobs that don't make a lot of money have more or as much stress associated with them. And people with higher classes will have stress as well, but there are outlets for that might not be elsewhere. Family life, marriage often happens within a class or the classes around a class. Usually you don't have someone that's at the top marrying someone at the bottom class-wise. Even still, divorce is higher among lower classes. Children are often unable to develop in the same way. For a lot of people in lower classes, their goal is for children to kind of learn on their own, to develop on their own, to survive. The goal is to provide them food and shelter and the basics. Whereas middle class, upper middle class is about developing children as people, well-rounded people. That can make a difference too. Let's go to the next slide. Education, right? Education is kind of the factor in sociology that most represents class and social mobility. People moving up in classes, right? The key to that upward mobility. But the wealthier you are, the easier you can afford college. You can afford to go to private school. You can afford to go to a prep school to get into a higher prestige university. That's kind of the key, and something we may explore a little bit, a little further as time goes on. Religion and politics. You wouldn't think that these have an influence in terms of class. But it does. Different denominations of religion align with different classes in the United States. And worship even looks different. Politically, there is, there are some interesting intricacies at play. People that are on the high end of class generally vote Republican. People on the lower end generally vote Democrat. There's been some change to that in specific geographic areas. College-educated people are changing a little bit, but it's kind of interesting. And then, as we move toward globalization and, the globalization of our economy, it's definitely something that those capitalists at the top are going to benefit from. And if you eliminate some of the jobs on the low end, that's going to hurt the lower classes. All right, let's keep going. So social mobility can happen for a lot of different reasons and different skills. Sometimes the economy changes. So if, let's say you are someone that in the 1980s was super into computers. There wasn't really jobs for that in the 70s and 80s. And so that may not have helped you. You might have been lower class, but, once you hit the 1990s and you have that boom, a lot of people that were computer programmers were making next to nothing and then started making six figures. It was a big mobility because of the change of the economy. So that can definitely happen as skills change, as the economy changes. People in different sectors might be more preferred, right? So that can definitely happen. But social mobility is not always a good thing. You think that, okay, moving down in social class, yeah, it's going to be painful. It's going to hurt. But moving up can as well, because you kind of get caught between the two worlds. So there was one study in the late 90s of British women who had moved from working class to middle class, were kind of caught between those two worlds, right? their kind of new middle class ways were more kind of uppity, and their daughter was criticized for not being kind of a common person. And then, but on the other side, is some of the working class tendencies wouldn't fly with the new middle class. So you have to find that balance, and that can be very difficult. So that's that's kind of the case. So, and women themselves have been a group that has mobilized the most socially over the past few decades, and something we're just kind of studying, right? As divorce has grown higher, as women have moved to the workforce more in the last 60, 70 years. There's been more study of that women haven't moved when we look at the 70s and 80s, especially because of the gender pay gap that has occurred, that women have been kind of stuck. But they are a group that is moving up as time goes on. I'll hit that a little bit more in the next slide as well. Let's move on to that. So, not all states are equal in terms of poverty. Some states have more poverty than others, something that we take a look at, where poverty varies in different places. Education levels, are not equal. Race ethnicities are not equal, right? That race and ethnicity is one of the strongest factors, predictors in terms of poverty, because of the difference in the racial history of America and where those opportunities lie. Education, is a big factor for poverty. If you have more education, you're less likely to be poor the more you move up. But it isn't a stronger factor than race, and something that we've hit on. And as I just talked about, that women have been moving up socially at a rapid pace. We're still studying that, but because of single mothers and the gender pay gap, that women on average only make 70% of what men make in America, that it's more likely for a single mom to be poor, to be in poverty because of that, even if she's working a job that shouldn't be that way. It's just called the feminization of poverty, and something that sociologists have really studied, something we'll take a look at further, because there can be some cognitive dissonance there with that. So, and the cultural view of poverty is skewed. There's been a lot of study done of how do you get out of poverty, and it's not through more work. You can't, even with working really hard, you can't really force yourself out of a class. You either have to get lucky, you have to get more education, which often isn't an option if you're working to eat and have a house. You can't pay for / have more time to go back to school, and so it becomes extremely difficult to rise in social classes. But even people that are poor often view this kind of American dream, and it's called the Horatio Alger myth. Horatio Alger is kind of a famous example of this poor person that through hard work overcame it and became more wealthy. But it really doesn't apply to most people. But we have this kind of view in America of the American dream that is possible. So even the poor kind of view themselves as one shot away from getting out of poverty, and often that skews where they view themselves. That they would rather kind of plan for that rather than plan for what's happening in their lives currently. So it's kind of the difference. So hopefully it makes sense. We'll dig more into a lot of this as we have in the past. Thank you so much, and I will talk to you soon.